The garage door shut with a groan behind us, closing us in the gloom of the single bulb hanging over the car. Mother took a drag off her cigarette and sighed as she exhaled. The smoke filled the cabin of the Ford and stung my eyes. "You really disappointed me today, Julianne." She tapped her cigarette in the ashtray below the dash. "You embarrassed me in front of the other mothers at the ice cream social, shoveling down seconds and thirds like a pig. I thought I raised you better than that." She took another drag, daintily holding the cigarette between her perfectly manicured fingers. "I'm going to have to tell your brother about this," she continued. "He'll have to come up with a punishment fit for a pig." I felt my stomach drop. My kid brother, Thomas, was only 6, but could be exceptionally cruel. Mother seemed to encourage him and was deferring to him more and more frequently for how the house was run, especially concerning my upbringing. "Mother, please, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to embarrass you. I'm sorry I was a pig and ate so much ice cream. I promise I won't do it again. I'll never eat any ice cream again." I was pleading with stone, unyielding. "Hush your mouth. Go to your room and wait for Thomas." She put out the cigarette and got out of the car. I had no choice but to follow. It felt like walking to the gallows as I stepped inside the house and headed towards the stairs to go to my room. Thomas had grown fond recently of physical punishment. He obviously delighted in Mother whipping me with a belt, or, recently, Mother had allowed him to start beating me with a wooden spoon. He would squeal and giggle like a normal child watching bubbles in the wind while I screamed. I was dreading whatever was going to happen tonight. I chastised myself for eating that ice cream. I should have known she would show up. My sins were always laid bare. Down the hall, I could hear Thomas watching television in the den. I only got to watch TV for half an hour on Saturday morning and new episodes of Happy Days with Mother and Thomas. Thomas got to watch all the TV he wanted. He could listen to the radio and turntable as much as he wanted, as loud as he wanted. Thomas had an entire room just for his toys. I entered my bedroom. It was a space I occupied, but it didn't feel like mine. Mother kept it Spartan, white walls and white bedspread, a crucifix over the bed and a painting of Jesus over the door. I had my desk and chair and a dresser with some of the porcelain dolls Daddy gave me before he died that Mother let me keep. That was it. I placed my book bag down and sat on my bed, waiting for Thomas. It was a while, sitting there with nothing but my own thoughts and staring at the open door. I felt humiliated. I was almost 13, and my entire life was dictated by my brother. Mother kept the house in constant lockdown to keep Thomas a secret. No outsiders were allowed in. I couldn't have friends because she was afraid I would mention him or sneak a friend in to gawk at my brother and tease him for being different. I would never make fun of him. I was terrified of him, terrified of what he was and what he was becoming. Eventually, I heard his heavy footsteps coming up the stairs, and I felt my heart start beating faster, and my palms began to sweat. I kneaded my skirt in my hands, trying to calm myself and dry my palms. His slow, arrhythmic footsteps came down the hall, and I watched him as he entered the room. I couldn't help but internally recoil at his appearance. Even though I'd known him since he was born, I could never adjust to how unnatural he appeared. Thomas had been born at home and had never seen a doctor, but he was obviously unwell. He was 6 years old and was barely over 2 feet tall, but very squat and wide. His skin was thick and gray, the whites of his beady eyes were yellow, and his hair was wispy and white, like an old man's, spreading out like a halo around his gargoyle face. A slight odor of decomposition hung about him. It reminded me faintly of garbage cans on a hot summer day. I hated when Mother made me help him with a bath. His skin felt like old brittle leather that flacked onto my clothes in gray flecks. His body was dense like concrete. I could barely lift him into the tub. Picking him up forced his hair into my face where that smell of rot would fill my nose. causing me to gag silently so as not to offend him and draw any ire from him or mother. Today, Thomas was wearing bib overalls with a red and green striped sweater underneath, reminding me of a grotesque doll. "Mama says you acted like a piggy today at the ice cream social," he spoke up to me in his unsettlingly high-pitched, yet raspy voice, like a child that smoked as much as mother. "You need to come down for dinner right now for your punishment for embarrassing Mama." He turned and walked back down the stairs, and I had no choice but to follow his toddling form downstairs to the dining table. We entered the kitchen, and the table was placed with 2 settings. Mother was already seated, and Thomas clambered up into his booster seat at his normal spot next to Mother. She took a drag off her cigarette and motioned vaguely to the floor without even looking at me. Neatly situated on the linoleum was my dinner, not on a plate, but directly on the floor. A pork chop, scoop of mashed potatoes, and a small pile of peas. No utensils either. Thomas giggled with glee upon seeing my face. "You have Mama's permission now to eat like a piggy now. No hands. Piggies just use their face." He stood up in his chair and reached out for Mother's ashtray and flung it out over my meal, peppering my dinner with cigarette, ash, and butts. "Oops. Piggies don't mind trash though, do they, Mama?" He giggled, and the sound filled me with rage. "No, they don't," Mother replied coolly while maneuvering her ashtray back in place and carefully putting out her cigarette before saying prayer. As angry as I was, I got down on my hands and knees and did my best at eating what I could without using my hands. I knew if I refused, it would be far worse. The whole meal, Thomas made pig noises and would reach down and poke me with his fork, making comments about what a fat piggy I was and how he wished he could roast and eat me. I doubted Mother would even object if he actually did kill me and eat me. Gagging my way through another bite of ashy pork chop, I felt a warm splat over my head and heard Thomas giggling. I reached up and felt he had dumped mashed potatoes into my hair. Choking down tears, I asked Mother if I could clean the floor and bathe. She rolled her eyes and excused me to clear the table for them as well while she changed Thomas into his pajamas. Picking him up, she walked out of the room, and Thomas stuck his putrid little purple tongue out at me before they made it out the kitchen door. I silently cried while I cleared the table and washed the dinner dishes. Tears splashed down as I mopped up the mess from my food on the floor. I hated how awful Thomas was. I hated how they treated me. Ever since Daddy died and Thomas showed up, I was their punching bag. I missed Daddy so much. Mother was kinder then, too. She was still severe, but Dad kept her tempered. After he died, there was a change that came over her. I was only 6, so I didn't remember her too much from before, but I did remember her gushing on and on when she was pregnant with Thomas. How the baby was a gift from our Heavenly Father, that it was going to complete our broken family. My 6th birthday happened right after Daddy died, and I remember sitting on the patio crying while the house was full of people after the funeral. Normally, he would have gotten me a new doll and a chocolate bar. Instead, I was forgotten. No doll. No chocolate. Just funeral potatoes and a house full of cigarette smoke from the adults. Nobody remembered. The closest thing I got was my dad's sister, Aunt Judy, sitting next to me on the patio step for a few minutes of comfortable silence before giving my shoulder a reassuring squeeze. I don't think she knew her brother was memorialized on my birthday. Next year, Thomas was born the day before my birthday, so it was completely eclipsed as Mother had just birthed her new love into the world. I stopped mid-mop as a light bulb finally went off. I had never put much thought into the dates before. Thomas was born a full year after Daddy died. He couldn't be his dad. Who was Thomas' actual father? Washing mashed potatoes out of my hair that evening, I ran over and over the timeline. No matter how I parsed it out, Thomas was only my half-brother. Going to bed that night, I kept myself awake, going over and over again to make sure. I couldn't remember any men being around at that time, but that didn't mean much. Adults can easily hide things from children. Tension began throbbing through my head, and I felt queasy. Mother had always known all of my secrets, able to sniff them out like a bloodhound out or using Thomas to spy. Now I had one of Mother's secrets, and I didn't know what to do with it. First, I wanted to confirm it, but it would mean snooping, which was difficult in a house that was rarely left empty. I would have to try finding Mother's calendar book or journal to see if she mentioned any dates or men. But when could I attempt such a daring maneuver? Thomas hardly left the house. As proud as Mother was of him, she was very cognizant and protective of his differences and didn't want to draw attention to herself or Thomas like that. Mother herself had few social engagements throughout the week and mostly stayed home to watch her golden child. I finally decided I would take the risk and fake sick on Tuesday, grocery day, so I could stay home from school while she went shopping. All Thomas did all day was watch TV downstairs, so that should give me about an hour to look through her room for clues. I decided to tuck my head down, try to behave as best as I could to avoid their wrath, and wait for Tuesday. That weekend limped along agonizingly slow. Thomas was in a fine mood and was constantly seeking out a reason to poke me, punch me, slap me. He'd laugh while calling me a piggy with his off-putting wide mouth. I tried to mostly stay in my room, and it seemed like neither of them cared. School on Monday was a relief, but my anxiety ramped up. The consequences would be dire if Mother caught on that I was faking sick to stay home. I didn't even want to imagine how off the leash she'd let my half-brother become in his punishment for that level of insubordination. I stayed up all night. My stomach was in knots, but I was committed to my plan. Throughout the night, I screamed as hard as I could into my pillow. Screamed until my throat was raw and I could barely talk. It felt cathartic in a way. When it was close to school time, I put on my heaviest flannel pajamas and began doing jumping jacks until my face was flushed and my scalp was soaked with sweat. Looking in the bathroom mirror before heading down to talk to Mother, I thought I looked pretty convincing. My skin was flushed and sweaty. My eyes had circles under them from lack of sleep, and my voice croaked like a frog. Heading downstairs, Mother was already feeding Thomas breakfast. I hesitantly stepped into the kitchen and stood there awkwardly for a second, pawing with my pajamas to keep my nerves steady until she noticed my presence and looked up. "Why aren't you dressed, Julian?" "I don't feel well. My throat hurts and my tummy hurts." My voice graveled out more than I was expecting. I really had hurt my throat. She strode over to me and placed a cool hand on my sweaty brow. "You do feel warm. Take an aspirin from the medicine cabinet and go lay back down. I'll check on you later." With that, she turned back and walked over to Thomas, who was frozen in place, glaring at me over a forkful of scrambled eggs. The sharp glint of malice in his beady eyes made me shiver before I shuffled out of the kitchen. I laid in bed, trying my best to look miserable until I eventually heard the faint sound of the television playing in the den as Thomas settled in for his normal daytime routine, and the garage door opened as Mother headed to the grocery store. I bounded out of bed and watched the car back out of our driveway and head up the street. My heart began to pound as I tiptoed down the hall to Mother's bedroom, a place I rarely even caught a glimpse of, let alone entered. I very slowly opened the door, taking great care to not make any noise to alert Thomas downstairs that I was out of bed. Creeping into the butter-yellow room, I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my skull. This was the naughtiest thing I had ever done by far. I stepped onto the rug to help disguise my footsteps and slowly made my way past the brass bed and towards her desk. My hands shook as I opened the top drawer. I pawed through rapidly and found nothing. I checked the next drawer down and again found nothing of interest, just stationery and envelopes. Finally, the bottom drawer was what I was looking for, a stack of journals from the past decade. I flipped through, trying to find entries relevant to when Daddy died and who Mother slept with afterwards. I've never fully recovered from what I read. July 6, 1968, Edgar died today. Car accident. I cannot believe this is real. My light, my life, my anchor. Dr. Benson gave me a sedative at the hospital, and I feel so tired. So very, very tired. Why has my Lord forsaken me so? July 9th, 1968. I feel like I am in a very bad dream. I feel numb and disconnected. All the consolation and pity from everyone makes me feel sick. After the memorial, it took everything in me to not break dishes and to scream at everyone to get out of my house. Julian was moping about crying, and I wanted to throw her out too. If I hadn't seen my dear Edgar's body in the hospital and held his urn in my own hands, I wouldn't believe he was really gone. I still don't entirely believe it. I have prayed to God every night, asking him to show me why he took my husband from me, and I have gotten no answer. I skimmed over the next few months, as it was more or less similar sentiments repeated night after night. I finally got to an entry that caught my eye. September 17th, 1968. My battle with my faith has been fraught the past few months, but hallelujah. I feel I can see the Lord again in all his glory and might, for he has given me a way to reconnect to my Edgar. I was thinking about the night Julian was born, right in this very home. It was a difficult birth, and she struggled to breathe at first. Ingrid, my midwife, made a comment to me that if the baby had failed to wake up on her own, that Ingrid had ways to make sure she would have made it. I remember asking if it was a medical methodology, and she made it clear to me that in certain circumstances, it was a mystical property she used to bring the air of life into a struggling baby's lungs. She gently alluded to being a practicing member of the dark arts. At the time, I felt quite scandalized to have someone like that in my God-fearing home. Now I see her as the answer to my prayers. My angel. On a whim, I called her and asked if she still practiced such techniques. She hesitantly confirmed that she did. I asked if she could turn breath into the lungs of a child without. Could she turn breath into a child that did not exist? Could she magic into existence another child of my beloved Edgar? She told me she had to do some research and she'd be back in touch. Ingrid just called back after a few hours and said there was a spell she found, but it was dangerous and might have unpleasant results. I said, yes, of course. I trust my Lord, and I believe he sent this woman of blessed magic to me for this purpose. She says we will have to do it soon, in a few days during the new moon. She has a potion to brew, but it is happening. Praise God. September 23rd, 1968. The ceremony was last night, and Ingrid believes it was a success, but we will have to wait. It did not take long, only an hour or two. Ingrid lit my bedroom with many beeswax candles, and she had me drink a thick and bitter tea that caused me to become quite relaxed and foggy. From my inner thigh, she cut me and collected my blood in a chalice, with which she mixed quite a lot of Edgar's ashes and other ingredients, which I could not glean from my supine position and groggy wits. Ingrid began to chant, calling upon a higher power, as I pleaded with my Lord to let this work, to give me any piece of my Edgar back. She came to the bed and worked the paste between my legs into my womanly chamber, which was very uncomfortable, but manageable with the numbing effects of the tea. She continued to sit with me and chant, her hand placed over my womb, until she decided at which time it was complete. She left, and I fell into a deep sleep. When I woke up this morning, I felt quite uncomfortable. My body ached, and when I used the restroom, a yellow fluid like pus poured out of me, but no sign of any ashes or blood, which gives me hope it was absorbed into my womb. November 3rd, 1968. Praise be to our Lord. Ingrid just confirmed for me that I am with child. I had been hoping so. I had not gotten my cycle in October, but I wasn't sure if that was because of the discharge like pus that was still coming. She told me that was common with this spell, and a side effect that would stop after the baby came. I feel like I am floating on air. For the first time since Edgar left, I feel I suddenly became very aware of the feeling of eyes on the back of my head. I had become too engrossed in what was written before me, and I had lost track of my surroundings. Very slowly, I turned around and my heart began pounding again as I saw Thomas standing in the doorway holding his wooden spoon in one hand. How had I not heard him? He pointed at me with his empty hand and screamed. Just a pure guttural screech from somewhere deep inside his disgusting little body. He charged at me from across the room, his horrible feet thumping solidly along the rug. He began beating my legs ruthlessly with the spoon, causing my legs to buckle. I crashed down to my knees in front of him, and he began lashing at my face, pulling my hair with one hand while wailing away at my head with the spoon. I had dropped the journal I was holding and was desperately trying to get a hand on the spoon or push him away. All I could hear was him screaming. My arms flailed and I reached around on Mother's desk and grabbed onto the first thing I found and sank it into Thomas' neck. The end of Mother's gold letter opener protruded under his jaw. He went silent and he looked at me with utter shock. He dropped the spoon and collapsed on the ground, clutching at his neck as his thick black blood oozed out from his wound, letting out a stupendous odor of rot that filled the room. He didn't really say anything or make any noise. He just twitched for a moment, and I saw his eyes glaze over. In shock, I stood over his little body for a moment, and I watched as he seemed to mummify in just a few minutes, like an ash person from Pompeii dressed in jeans and a flannel shirt. Even his blood that looked like shiny oil a second ago became like potting soil on Mother's rug. Reaching out to touch his hand, it crumbled away like sand. Panic ran through me like a rabbit caught in a snare. Not knowing what to do, I ran. I ran down the hall, changed my clothes, put an extra change of clothes in my backpack, and the last doll Daddy had ever given me, and I ran. Mother would absolutely never forgive me, and I was genuinely afraid she would kill me in retaliation for taking her beloved Thomas away from her. Her precious gift from God. My feet flew over the pavement and took me away from that house. I called my Aunt Judy from a payphone outside the Five and Dime and told her Mother had kicked me out and asked if I could stay with her. She had always had a strained relationship with my mother, and it didn't take much convincing that she had kicked out her only child. Only mother, Ingrid, and I ever knew about Thomas. She gave me a home and took care of me. She never beat me or humiliated me. Even with her love, I was far from okay. For years, I would close my eyes and hear Thomas scream, then the sudden silence. I'd see him fumbling at his neck and turning to ash. But I would also remember all the ways he would hurt me and how bad he was becoming. I could never talk to anyone about it, especially not the silent relief I felt I refused to admit to myself. Over time, however, Thomas' screams became a whisper, and his silence faded into dust in my mind. I moved on with my life. I went to college and became a photojournalist, getting to travel the world and watch history unfold. By choice, I never married, but was quite blessed with many beautiful friendships for companionship over the decades. I found balance in my life and a sense of happiness, if not peace. I never could quite stomach mashed potatoes again, though. They always taste ashy to me. Mother never made any attempts to reach out to me or find me, at least that I'm aware of. 10 years ago, I was contacted by a hospital, and they said my mother had been admitted earlier after falling and was about to pass, so she must have kept some tabs on me to know my phone number for her emergency contacts. Apparently, she had collapsed in the driveway, and a neighbor called an ambulance. I got there, and her only words to me were, "Take care of him," as she placed a locket in my hand. I opened the locket. Jesus was on one side, Thomas on the other. I didn't say anything to her, just held her frail old hand with nicotine-stained nails until she passed in the night. My mother was gone, and I felt nothing except a vague sense of relief. When I got to her house, it was like a time capsule. Other than a newer television, it was just like it was when I'd fled so many years ago. The smell of tobacco smoke hung like incense in the air. It felt oppressive, like a tomb. I wandered the house in a bit of a daze. The one place I didn't want to go was upstairs. I didn't want to see my old room, or Thomas' room, or Mother's. Putting it off, I went to fix myself some supper, realizing I hadn't eaten in almost a day. I took a pause when I opened the fridge and saw a baby bottle on a shelf. Silently praying she had been babysitting for a neighbor, I fixed myself some toast with sardines and sat eating in the den watching TV. It had been almost 40 years, and it still felt rebellious not eating at the table and watching TV without permission. My eyes grew heavy, and I finally mustered up the gumption to head upstairs to go to bed. The stairs creaked in a familiar way under my feet, and I was taken back to the feeling of dread hearing either Mother or Thomas climbing up. My old room was at the top of the stairs. I saw the door was nailed shut and had rambling quotes about Judas copied from the Bible in my mother's handwriting taped to the door. I sighed gently and turned from the door to head down the hallway, deciding Mother's room was probably the best place to sleep. I passed by Thomas' toy room, and I heard a murmur from the room. I stopped. Curiosity got the best of me, and I entered. In Thomas' old toy room was a crib with joyful clown sheets. Dread swelled up inside me as I heard more murmurs and saw the sheets move. Approaching slowly, I peeked under the sheet and gasped. Tucked inside was what looked like a baby gargoyle, gray and papery looking. Pus leaked out of its milky, bulbous eyes. I pulled back the blanket and saw it had no legs and its arms bent back like wings on a bird. It was wearing just a cloth diaper, overflowing with terry-looking stool that took my breath away with its pungency. It smelled like Thomas' blood, but somehow worse. My heart broke for this poor creature. Lord only knows how many years it has been in this crib suffering from its unholy existence. So this is who Mother had wanted me to take care of. Not knowing what else to do, I gently scooped him up. Like Thomas, he was shockingly heavy for how small his body was. Placing him on the changing table, I cleaned him and rewrapped his bottom in a clean diaper cloth. It was difficult. He fussed tremendously, crying and flopping around as much as his flipper-like arms would allow. I tried wiping off his oozing eyes, and he snapped his mouth, which I saw was full of disturbingly square yellow teeth, trying to bite me. I carried him to the kitchen and rocked him while I heated up his bottle, and he became furious with me, almost barking like a dog when my hand would get near his face. He settled a bit as he fed, but he would still sometimes suddenly spit out the bottle and attempt to bite me. I laid him back in his crib, this abomination in a clown sheet, and I walked down the hall to Mother's room, letting out a long sigh. Combing through my mother's journals in the early hours of the morning, it looked like she tried the ceremony again shortly after Thomas died, but she either lacked Ingrid's help or didn't have enough of my father's ashes left. Something went terribly wrong. She was vaguer than she had been about Thomas' conception, but I suspect she had used some of Thomas' remains. The resulting birth she named Isaac. Mother's journals told a sad tale of her and Isaac's suffering. She never mentioned me, but lamented the loss of Thomas and Dad relentlessly. She was hyper-protective of Isaac, as that was all she had left. If her world had been small before, it became microscopic after he entered her life, requiring nearly constant care. According to Mother, he was blind and colicky, sometimes going years at a time without sleeping through the night. She had breastfed him for years, but she had to stop after he grew teeth and began biting her intentionally and feeding on her blood. I spent a lot of time over the next few days pondering what to do. I had to get her estate in order. She had left me the house in an obvious attempt to get me to continue caretaking for Isaac, but I didn't want it. I had my own cozy home an hour away from here, filled with happy memories and my possessions acquired traveling the world. Mother's home had a heavy energy I couldn't shake. Her and Thomas were both gone, but the memories of the scoldings and beatings hung in every corner, like cobwebs that would never sweep away. So, I fed Isaac and kept him clean and tried to keep him company, although he seemed to hate me passionately. I took care of him, all the while thinking about what I was going to do. After a week, I felt resolute in what had to be done. Gathering up all of Mother's journals in a tote, I made my way to Isaac and picked him up and carried everything to the living room. The ancient logs in the fireplace meant for display ignited instantly. One by one, I fed the journals into the fire, burning away years of my mother's consuming sorrow. Isaac fussed and moaned next to me the entire time. When the last pages shimmered away into lacy ash, I took a throw pillow off the couch and gently cradled Isaac in my other arm. It didn't take long before he stopped struggling, and I felt his little body relax after decades of suffering. I gently wrapped up a bundle in a clown sheet and placed it in the fire. It burned furiously, like the paper in my mother's journals, and was soon gone. Nothing but ashes and embers. "Don't worry, Mother," I said purely for my own sake. I took care of Isaac for you, and finally I felt at peace. Story 2. My daughter asked me where nightmares come from. I told her the story my father told me, and his father told him. Long ago, there were no nightmares, only memories. Memories of the things that men do and the things men see. Then sometime around the 5th century, during the migration of Germanic tribes into what would become most of Western Europe, there was a lord. And like many lords of the time, he acquired land. He acquired this land the way everyone acquired land then. He conquered it. It was in the aftermath of a particularly brutal battle, near the edges of a deep crevice, that the Lord found a pale child wandering among the littered corpses. It was a girl blackened by smoke and stained with the spattered blood of the fallen. She had dark eyes and a misshapen body with deformities that made even the bravest soldiers avoid her gaze and step from her path. Now this lord was a generous one, loved by his men and his people, and he felt pity for this impish girl, and he took her in, raising her within the confines of his castle. He named the girl Nocturne for her dark eyes and her peculiar habit of avoiding sleep and staying up late into the night, seemingly for days and weeks at a time. Despite her appearance, Nocturne soon showed a jester's talent for making the lord and the neighboring aristocracy laugh and enjoy themselves at her stories, tales, and tricks. This lord also had a handsome son, a prince who would one day inherit the throne, the castle, and its lands. The prince, like the others, enjoyed the antics of this little girl who was always by his father's side, telling stories and riddles to delight the crowd. But each night, the prince would watch as Nocturne would whisper into the lord's ear at day's end, leaving the prince to question this girl jester, and the way his father seemed so enthralled by such a grotesque and deformed comedienne who never seemed to sleep. Soon the prince was of age, and he prepared to leave the castle for his studies. He embraced his father tightly, knowing they would not see each other for years. As he rode away, leaving the only home he knew for the very first time, He glanced back at the castle and the people surrounding his waving father. The last thing he saw before the castle slipped from view was Nocturne there at his father's side, whispering her whispers in his ear. The stories reached the prince in the final year of his schooling. They seemed fantastical at first, claiming that his father had become a monster, a bane to his very land. It seemed the Lord had begun taxing his people harshly and imprisoning any who could not pay, condemning them to the bowels of the castle to await some form of trial and eventually a horrible death. There were tales of lavish sin-fueled parties where the Lord would fly into rages at others, often baiting guests into heated debates, only to shackle them in chains for disobeying his view or command. Neighboring lords and landowners avoided the castle, fearing the tales of torture, and staying clear of the screams that lasted well into the night. And within each chilling account, what each witness never ceased to mention was that the girl Nocturne was there, with her strange whispers for only the Lord's ear. It seemed that Nocturne was either immune to the Duke's blood rage or the very cause of it. Now, with this madness consuming his father, the prince was told that neighboring lords were preparing to siege the castle and divide its lands among them. As the prince rode quickly for home, he knew that any such battle would be short, since recent tales told that much of the castle had been abandoned and now only the Lord and Nocturne lived within its bloodied walls. As the prince neared the castle, he galloped past the villages he remembered as a young man. Once vibrant and alive, they were now shells of towns, filled with the starving, the desperate, and the dead. The castle road was littered with bloated corpses, and the creek he once played in as a boy ran red with blood. The prince burst into the castle, sword drawn, and called for his father. From a splintered bench in the corner of the throne room, the Lord's feeble voice replied. The prince's father was now thin, with sunken eyes and trembling hands, but he stood feebly and reached longingly for his son. The prince embraced his father and asked if the stories were true. The Lord nodded, shame washing over his pale face. Gripping his sword tight, the prince roared for Nocturne, vowing to end this damnable reign of madness. She appeared behind him, whispering a welcome to the prince. She was seated on the Lord's throne, her small, crooked body dwarfed by the immense gilded chair. The prince lunged at Nocturne, but his sword was halted inches from her throat by the call of his father, who cried no in labored gasps. The weak lord told his son that Nocturne was no girl, but a witch raised from hell that day on the battlefield. It was her whispers, her foul and tiny voice in his ear, that spread the madness, a rain of nightly tales of horror that he would in turn make real by day. The Lord said he kept Nocturne here in the castle, fearing that her tales, should they spread through the land, would inflict the very same horrors that happened here at his home. With this, the Lord gripped his son's hand, looked to Nocturne's black eyes, and let out his last cold breath. The prince's eyes filled with tears, seeing his dead father. As for Nocturne, she laughed. It was a tiny laugh, but a laugh that filled the prince with rage. He stood and stared into the eyes of that small witch, and in one swift motion, sank his sword through her down to its hilt. Nocturne's laugh went silent, and her eyes bulged black. Dark blood seeped from her stunted mouth. A watery, bubbling sound crept up from deep within her, traveling up her throat and past her bloodied lips. It was one last whisper, an evil sound that echoed throughout the castle, past its gates, past its lands, and rang out into our world. Years went by, and the prince was eventually killed in battle, and the castle was divided among the aristocracy. The tale of Nocturne, the Lord, and the prince was almost lost to time and the long shadows of a growing and aging Europe. But some still share the tale of the sleepless Nocturne, the girl who was something not human, a creature beyond the grip of sleep or night or day. For what the king said that day to his son was true. When Nocturne was killed, she was released into the ether and sent adrift into our world. She is now free to whisper to more than just one old lord. Her whispered stories and tales and riddles can now reach us all while we sleep. Gone are the kings, dukes, and lands of old. Now there are factories, industry, automobiles, and airplanes. But Nocturne remains, creeping silently into the bedrooms of men, of women, and especially of children. As she did with that long-dead lord, she whispers into your ear while you sleep, and breathes vile tales of terror, of dread, and the drip, drip, drip of human poisons she has witnessed on this earth. Maybe she'll whisper in your ear, or maybe she already has. Because, like I told my daughter, she is where nightmares come from. Story 3. I found an old recording of the most gruesome TV show ever broadcast. Me and Leela always carved dozens of jack-o'-lanterns every October, so they'd absolutely saturate our lawn on Halloween night. It was our thing. But looking back on it, now that I've lost her, I just feel bad for the pumpkins. I almost relate to them somehow. The way they were carved up had everything of substance inside of them torn out and left as hollow, rotting shells with forced smiles. Needless to say, I didn't cope with her death well. I didn't want to cope with it. I wanted the world to drown in the black sludge of my grief. I loathed the people I saw going about their lives, unaware that the world had already ended the moment Leela died. The earth shouldn't keep spinning. Life shouldn't go on. Not without her. Even my relatives bringing me along on a trip to Kauai only made it worse. The most gorgeous place on earth, and it made me sick with hatred. Nothing that beautiful deserved to exist if Leela wasn't ever going to get to see it. It wasn't fair. I thought I'd never enjoy or care about anything again. Then I discovered media preservation. It started with taking some of Leela's old VHS tapes to a video repair place to fix some issues with the footage before it's digitized. The job fascinated me. In a universe based on entropy, where everything inevitably fades away and is forgotten, restoring something lost is like snatching it from the jaws of death, right? Like flipping the bird to the universe and its so-called natural order. People die, but information doesn't have to. Now, it doesn't matter how small, be it some god-awful plug-and-play licensed game, or a serial commercial from A to E's. It's my mission to recover it in as high a quality as I'm able, and make sure it's freely available online for as long as possible. A couple weeks ago, I came across a big haul. 4 boxes of old VHS tapes offered up on eBay for dirt cheap. Most of the tapes were just recordings of Cheers episodes already preserved in higher qualities, but one Maxell E240 caught my interest. First of all, I'd never seen one so melted. Sure, sometimes they were left in an attic too long, and the colors and audio start to degrade. But this one looked like it had survived a house fire. It was covered in soot and the smell of smoke, and had the overall shape of a chocolate bar left out in the sun a little too long. Second was the label, which read in neat Sharpie, 4,679,329, 8/2035. The casing was so disfigured, I had to bust it apart, just pull out the tapes and respool them in a fresh cassette. I tried to iron out the creases in the tape as best I could, but I had no illusions about it accomplishing much. The mylar surface had been irreparably warped in places by whatever fire had half melted the thing. Imagine my despair at the sight of that dreaded. I could clearly see the tape wasn't blank, yet no amount of adjusting the tracking or trying different TVs or VCRs accomplished anything. Just as I was about to give up, though, the thing just suddenly started playing properly at the exact instant the clock struck AM, as if it had only now decided to work. My all-nighter had paid off. I didn't dwell on the fact that this miracle fix had been impossible. If I'd had any sense, I'd have torn the horrid thing out of my VCR and buried it beneath holy ground. Instead, fool I was, I sat down and watched. At first, the thing seemed unwatchable. The audio was so distorted that the show's theme song emerged as a low, crackling, staticky wail that made my head throb, and the logo was completely indistinguishable through the flickering and interference. I thought it was a lost cause for a moment, but then a figure appeared and cleared away the static, like Moses parting the Red Sea. It was the sight of the show's host that hooked me. He was just perfect. Perfect in every way. I knew it just looking at him. Infinitely handsome and likable and charismatic, and he always said the exact perfect thing. The only issue is, I don't remember a single thing about him now, in the same way you can't remember a dream that seemed so clear to you while you were experiencing it. He just appears in my memory as this abstract blur in a sharp suit. Yet at the time, I was awestruck, even before he said a single word. I can't even remember a word he said. It was like he was speaking another language, one I felt as opposed to heard. I'll try and transcribe it as best I can into words, but know that it's only a pathetic imitation. For another night of laughs, prizes, and fun for the whole family with your host, I noticed that the audio and visual distortion seemed to suddenly intensify the instant he said his name, rendering it completely illegible. Idiot I was. I figured that was a coincidence. Tonight is a night of celebration, folks, because thanks to the support of loyal viewers like you, we have just been approved for, get this, 200,000 more seasons. The live studio audience went wild with applause. I put that in scare quotes because, as far as I could tell, besides the host, the studio seemed completely empty, as if he was standing on a plain white stage that extended outwards into infinite darkness on all sides. For those just joining us, the game here is simple. He explained that this was some sort of a trivia show. Every time a guest got an answer wrong, it brought them a little closer to some sort of unspecified punishment. And if they got it right, he smirked. Well, they get to delay the inevitable. I wondered what he meant by inevitable. I didn't have to wonder long. The host gestured to a curtain that hadn't been there moments ago, which raised to reveal a middle-aged man. You know the type: bushy mustache, gray hair, round-rimmed glasses. Kind of guy you'd have doing your plumbing. He couldn't look any more out of place, stood up and restrained in that, "What the hell is that?" I recognized that metal coffin-looking thing from a medieval torture museum I went to once. The Iron Maiden. The lid hung open, countless long, needle-like blades poking inwards, threatened to poke a million new holes in him if it was shut. His situation was not lost on him. Where am I? What the hell is this? Oh, lucky guess. The host joked. More canned laughter. I know you always loved watching those trivia shows, Malcolm. Weren't you always sitting there, grinding your teeth, seething that it wasn't fair? That you should be the one up on stage, winning big? The man paused. Even he seemed mesmerized by the unreal perfection of the host before him. This is a game show. All you have to do is answer a few questions. Think you can handle that, Malcolm? He pulled out a cue card without waiting for an answer. And our first question: what were you doing the night of February 18th, 1998? The man seemed baffled. Just sat on my couch watching the NFL, I think. I'm not sure how I'm supposed to remember. He let out a startled squeal as a horrid buzzer sounded. On cue, the lid slid a third of the way closed, making him flinch. Ooh, I'm afraid that's the wrong answer, Frank. But you know what? I'll give you one more chance. What were you following a girl home? The man cried out, "F from the bar." "There, are you happy?" "Correct," the canned audience began cheering. Such honesty. Now, our second question. Just what were you carrying while you followed her? He hesitated for a little too long. And then the buzzer sounded again, and the lid slid so near to closing that its blades began poking uncomfortably against his skin. He tried to press himself against the back of the maiden, as well as his restraints would allow. Jesus. Okay. A knife, a knife. Oh, if only you'd said that just a second earlier. Another big question. Our third question, why, Malcolm? Why did you do it? That set Malcolm off. He started thrashing, clawing, screaming. Let me out of this thing, you maniac. You can't do this to me. Do you know who I am? Is this some sort of sick joke? My lawyers will have your head for this. You, and then the buzzer. All of a sudden, the lid slammed shut full force, and the man was utterly silenced save for an unnatural, drawn-out wheeze. Another wrong answer, Malcolm. I'm afraid I was looking for, because if I can't have her, no one can. I admit it. I laughed, out of shock more than anything. How was this allowed on TV? I took it as some sort of dark comedy show, and it was kind of satisfying to see that freaky character get his comeuppance. Still, there was something unnerving to me, seeing the man's eyes through the openings in the maiden. Wide and red and terrified. They just looked a little too real. But the maiden disappeared as quickly as it came, before I could dwell on it too much. Oh, envy. Definitely one of my favorite sins, more laughter. Stay tuned, folks. We've still got a night of fun and games in store for you. But first, how's about a word from our sponsors? Cut to a corporate logo which I again couldn't recognize. This segment was made possible by Boer Health, which has recently announced a brilliant new initiative to protect our citizens from skin cancer by removing their skin completely, the camera cut, to a massive industrial building resembling a solid concrete cube around 50 meters in width and height. Its surface bore arcane symbols etched using carvings of wailing, tormented faces. The host would occasionally be rendered inaudible by a deafening metallic scraping from within, though he didn't seem to notice. The only protrusion from the building's cubic shape was a single smokestack, belching a scarlet-red smoke into the atmosphere. A queue of gaunt figures waited at the entrance, herded and coerced by their grim overseers, and there were no words to describe the procession of scarlet ghouls limping out the building's other end. Owing to the non-linearity of time, the brand-new grand skin-peeling machine has spontaneously appeared several years before construction deadlines, and indeed, before it was even conceived by anyone in our timeline. People have rushed all the way from Malabulge just to try this miracle of technology out on opening day, and so far, the reviews have been stellar. He shoved his microphone in the face of a shambling thing that could only scarcely be called a human. Tatters of flesh clung to its exposed musculature, blowing in the wind. Its eyes were the only hint of color in that sea of bloody red, and they were wide, white, and terrified. The thing screamed and wailed for as long as it could, before the last tendons connecting its jaw to its face snapped, and it was left to choke and gurgle. An amazing wail. The results speak for themselves, folks. The grand skin-peeling machine is a hit. So far, I was still laughing along and having a good time. The sight of the next guest, however, started making me nervous. It was an old lady. She couldn't be a day younger than 60, the sort of sweet elderly woman who in a just world would be cooking chocolate chip cookies for her grandchildren in a comfy cottage somewhere. But here she was, tied to a metal chair, eyes wide, shaking like a leaf. Unlike the last contestant, she seemed to know exactly what was happening. In exchange for our loving endorsement, they've agreed to loan us one of their star employees. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for, the Likizma. Something slunk from the darkness far behind her, or perhaps it'd be more apt to say that the darkness birthed it whole cloth. It was like a living shadow, and it took my eyes a moment to register what I was even seeing. How do I even begin describing this creature? I could say it looked almost human, or at least like something that may have been human long ago. Or I could start with its skin, which was all black and shiny as latex, and seemingly smooth on first glance. But if you looked closer, you'd realize it was covered in a million tiny reptilian scales, almost like a shark. Its head was a bald man's, utterly devoid of any distinguishing features, like the basic stock template for a human being. It was notable only for a complete lack of pupils and irises, its eyes a pure white. Its body defied basic biology in so many key ways. I had to stare at it for what felt like an eternity, just to wrap my mind around its physiology. It was at least 5 or 6 meters long, by my estimate, composed of multiple human torsos stacked one on top of the other like segments of a centipede, each melding with the ones around it at the waist and shoulders. Each torso sported a pair of short, stubby arms that propelled it with terrifying grace. It ended with a pair of human legs, perpetually bent on their knees, beneath a tail that looked more like its coccyx was poking free from its body. The old last could clearly hear it, and kept futilely trying to turn her head around enough to get a peek at what stood behind her. I mouthed uselessly, "Don't. You don't want to know. Glad you could join us again, Miss Weathersby. Judging by our ratings last week, you seemed to have been a fan favorite." Her voice was so soft, I could barely hear it below the static. "Oh, God. Please, why won't you people let me go? I've told you, I've never done anything, never hurt anybody. There must be some sort of—" He waved a hand over her, and it seemed to forcefully snap her mouth shut. "Please, Miss Weathersby, save your breath for our questions." Another cue card. "Your first question, my friend. Where did you and your husband buy your first home?" She had to think about it for a long time. Eventually, she cried out, "Alabama. Tuscaloosa, Alabama." Ding, ding, ding. Why, you're already doing better than our first contestant. Next question. What breed of dog was your childhood pet? She had a pained look on her face as she thought. Eventually, a timer started ticking down. It wasn't visible, so it wasn't clear how much time she had left exactly, but the sound it made got more shrill and high-pitched with every second. "Miss Weathersby, need I remind you that we have a time limit on this show?" A tear ran down her cheek. I keep telling you people, I don't know. I have dementia. I can't remember, please, that buzzer again. I'm afraid that was the wrong answer. Likizma?" The old lady shuddered at the sounds of hundreds of feet, drawing a little closer to her. "Now, your first grandchild. What did he look like? What color were his eyes? His hair?" She was crying harder now, like it hurt her that she couldn't remember something so dear to her. "I told you I can't remember. Why are you doing this to me? If you don't remember them, why would they remember you?" The host mocked as the buzzer sounded, and the beast drew a little closer. "Really, do you believe they still even think about you? Or do you think they're glad that the old bag of bones isn't there sucking up their inheritance?" This went on for, God, it could have been an hour. I was glued to the screen all the while, frozen with terror, praying for this nightmare to just end, for her to make it out okay somehow. He pored over every little detail of the life she lived and the people she loved, delighting in how little of it she could still recall. And the thing grew closer and closer, until she finally felt multiple pairs of hands resting upon her shoulders. The thing was looming over her now, and a long, black tongue a few feet in length emerged from its mouth and ran trails of dark saliva over the back of her head. She looked broken down, eyes raw from crying, and I could tell by the dampness of her dress that she'd wet herself. Now, Miss Weathersby, our time here has been fun, but I do believe it is time for our final question. Tell me, what is the name of your only son?" She couldn't even answer any more. She just stared ahead, like her mind was a million miles away. He cackled as the buzzer sounded one final time, and threw his cue cards aside. "Thank you for playing, Miss Weathersby. Better luck next time." I would say the thing unhinged its jaw like a snake, but that'd be an understatement. The way the thing's face malformed and wrinkled and stretched as it opened its maw, it no longer looked even remotely human. Its jaws must have parted at least 30 centimeters apart, revealing a second pharyngeal pair of jaws that lashed out and gripped the woman's skull, pulling her headlong into that darkness. I could hear bones crunching and snapping as its throat constricted down around her body, peristaltic muscles compacting her into a meat slurry, bit by bit. Yet she just wouldn't die. Even as her skull and upper body were already crushed and compacted, organs and muscles pressed into mulch, she still kicked her legs, twitched her fingers, let out a gurgling that must have been some attempt at screaming. She was squirming even as the beast snapped its jaw shut around the last of her, condemning her to whatever torments awaited her inside the creature. And all the while, that horrible laughter. "Don't worry, folks. She'll be back next week. And the next. And the next." Needless to say, I wasn't having fun anymore. In fact, I had to turn away and fight the urge to throw up. I stood, about to turn the TV off, and "Don't touch the dial now." I froze. There was something chilling about the way he said that, staring right into the screen as if reacting to what I was doing. I hated that grin on his face. The real show is just beginning, and with the barely restrained excitement of a child on Christmas morning, he yanked back another curtain, and I recognized everything. I recognized that crappy bootleg knockoff Always Sunny in Philadelphia jacket that was so gaudy and terrible it instantly became her favorite thing in her wardrobe. I recognized those subtle hints of slight acne she disguised as fake freckles. I recognized the way her gray eyes would remind me of those overcast mornings at the beach at Hilton Head, and pointing out all the cannonball jellyfish washed up on the sands. I recognized the tattoo of the name, how I'd held her all night long as she cried into my shirt after her childhood cat had died. It was Leela. I shuddered, gasped, fell from my seat as if I'd been punched in the stomach and the air had been knocked out of me. I couldn't breathe. This couldn't be real. I was dreaming right now. I must be. I just had to wake up. But I couldn't wake up. Nothing I could do dispelled the sight of her curled up in that thing. That bronze statue of a bull, horns jutting on either side of a head, that roaring silently up at the heavens, all while the love of my life was locked in its hollowed-out belly, visible only through a pane of glass. I could hear her cry out in shock at where she'd found herself, and every whimper felt like it drove a knife through my chest. The host soaked in the moment. It was ecstasy for him, the suffering of it all. He stared dead into the camera like he was looking right at me as she called, "What is this? Where am I? Why, I have good news, my dear Leela. You're exactly where every American dreams of being. You're on TV." He pointed to the camera. "And we have a very special guest in the audience tonight. Your very own beloved Jackson." I shuddered, hearing my own name ooze from his fetid lips. His faud of perfection was slipping, and there was something so profoundly ugly beneath it. Her eyes snapped to the camera, confused, despairing. "Jackson? Baby? What's happening? What is this?" "I don't know," I thought, gripping the sides of the TV so hard my knuckles turned white. "But I'm going to get you out of there, baby. I'm going to find whoever did this, and I'm going to bury them all so far beneath that studio that they'll never, I'm afraid Jackson hasn't joined us quite yet, my dear. But if you truly love him, surely you'll give him a show to remember, won't you?" He taunted her. "All I want, after all, is to ask you a few questions. In fact, I'll offer you a special deal. Get even a single answer right, and I'll let you go free. But get one wrong, and well." On cue, a fire was lit beneath her. Small, smoldering for now, but she whimpered as she noticed the heat. We both realized in that instant what this was. By now, I was screaming things I can't repeat here, and slamming my hands against the TV screen as if I could reach through and save her. She bit her lip and acquiesced. Not like she had any room to argue. The host grinned and readied a cue card. "Your first question. Where are you, Leela?" I don't know." "How am I supposed to know?" "You do know, Leela. You know exactly where you are." He smirked at her. "Here's a free hint. What's the last thing you remember before you woke up here?" She thought about it and choked back a sob, visibly shaking as the realization slowly settled in. But why? I. The horrible wail of the buzzer cut her off. "Ooh, too bad. I'm afraid you've run out of time." Seemingly as if on its own, the fire doubled in size. Sparks licked the belly of the bronze bull and began to ever so slowly heat the surface. She pawed around in the tight confines, searching for any reprieve from the scalding heat all around her as the metal grew hot, like it had been left out in the sun on a summer's day. "Please? Oh God, let me out of this thing. It hurts. It hurts." The host seemed to breathe in her pain as if stealing a moment's indulgence. "Now that there is no doubt about where you are, my dear, let us proceed to the second question." He switched to his next card. "Did you believe in God in the end?" "Oh, of course." She pled her case as if she was being tried in court. "My entire life. Every day I gave to the poor, helped the sick, did whatever I could to honor high." "I'm afraid you misunderstood my question. I asked, did you believe in him at the end? The very moment your pitiful little life was snuffed out." "I always believed I'd never forsake him." Yes, I know. You lived a good and holy life, didn't you?" He cackled. "But what of the very end? You and your little husband were so excited to deliver your first little baby boy. But oh, tragedy. It all went wrong, didn't it? Your precious little boy didn't make it through childbirth. And you followed closely behind. That whole business with the botched pregnancy, it was. What do you call it? Oh, yes. A test of faith. And I'm afraid you failed. In your final moments, you watched the light fade from your child's eyes, and you assumed wisely, in my humble opinion, that no kind and loving God would allow something like that to happen." He laughed. "Funny how after a lifetime of dutiful service, all it takes is one little mistake at the end to bring you here. To us, I'd never seen such depths of despair in a person's eyes. Such emptiness. Like with every word, he'd been scooping out another piece of her until she was hollow. And then that buzzer roared again, more shrill than ever, and I could barely see her little window through the smoke and flames. The belly of the bull was turning orange in places, and I could hear her flesh start to sizzle like meat on a grill. There are no words for the noises she made. No words at all. And our last final question," he continued. "What were your last words to your poor, beloved Jackson?" "I love you." I called out the answer. Bloody fingerprints stained the TV screen from my slamming my hands against it, as I screamed the answer over and over. "I love you, I love you, I love you." At some point, I forgot that there was ever a question. I was just screaming it at her, as if hoping that she could hear it, that it could bring her a modicum of comfort in that place. The buzzer sounded again. I couldn't bring myself to look. All I could hear was the roaring of the bull and the steam rising from its bronze nostrils. The curtain fell. Silence drowned the sound. The host dropped all pretense that he hadn't been speaking directly to me. "Now, Jackson, you just might be one of my new favorite audience members this show had ever had. I know this must have been hard for you, but if you'll just stay tuned, I have one more show I know you're certain to love." I didn't bother to touch the remote. After all, nothing could be worse than what I'd just seen, right? Wrong. Horror racked me as the curtain rose, and I saw the man chained to a chair. I pulled away like a caveman witnessing fire, cringing and stuttering, face wet with sweat. It was the sort of fear that worked its way into your bones like a bad chill, that left you shaking, teeth chattering. It was me. An older me, sure, but not by much. 10 years, maybe. A gaunt and hollow version of me, one twisted by 10 years of depression and hard drugs. But it was unmistakable. His eyes widened as he recognized the host. Oh, God, God, please no. It can't be, oh Christ. Let me out of this chair. You come now. We wouldn't want to use the Lord's name in vain, would we? I mean, that would be a sin. The host laid a hand on the other me's shoulder. It may have been a few years since you watched our program, but I'm sure you remember the rules, don't you, old friend? The other me was wordless, on the verge of hyperventilating, just as I was. The host was giddy with delight. Now, our first and only question is one I'm sure our viewer will be very interested in. What sins exactly do you think landed you here? The other me tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. I could see it in his eyes. The years of self-destruction, the bitter hopelessness, the whirlpool of nihilism and vice and decay, the suffocating depths of a man, the darkness. How could he put it into words? The sound of the buzzer was like a pig's squeal. I'm afraid that our viewer is going to have to figure that out for himself. In the meantime, your punishment? Well, we wouldn't want to spoil anything. The curtains slowly began to fall just as a couple other of those black, grotesque monstrosities emerged from the darkness. The curtain covered them all before I could get a good look at their obscene, twisted, asymmetrical figures. All I could hear was the crunching, the sound of skin tearing like paper, the screaming that went on for longer and louder than a human throat or vocal cords could endure. The image and audio were beginning to distort, glitch, burn away. The tapes were physically melting as they played. My VCR was starting to overheat, sparks pouring from its front panel. The host voice jumped around in tone, his voice fading into the static blur as the tapes bubbled and boiled and distorted. But, my friends, I'm afraid that concludes tonight's episode of our show. So, with a final farewell to our dear, beloved viewer, Jackson. Just before the image melted away, the camera seemed to jump forward until his face filled the screen, his eyes piercing into mine as he cackled in that sing-song voice.